Our next presenter is Bettina Bradbury from the Department of History at York University, the first of 5 historians, I think, this afternoon. Bettina is someone who came to Canada to pursue her historical study, as I'm sure you'll recognize in just a few minutes when she takes the microphone. She has also come to this meeting directly from her home and native land, which is New Zealand. Bettina's reputation as a historian rests primarily, but not exclusively, on her enormously detailed and yet informative work on Montreal from a feminist and family history perspective, work that is deeply rooted in the archives, that is reflective of enormously hard work in those kinds of sources, and that also speaks across a range of subject material and to fields as diverse as colonial history and legal history. So Bettina's contribution to the understanding of Canada has been very significant, and I'm delighted to invite her to the microphone.
Bonsoir, hi. It was not part of my life plan when I came to Canada in 1972 from New Zealand to become a Canadian or a Quebec historian. I didn't even have an undergraduate degree in history, nor did I intend to stay. So it's a great honor, 41 years later, to be admitted into this society. C'est un bon moment pour moi de remercier tous les professeurs, les collègues, les autres personnes qui m'ont enseigné l'histoire et qui m'ont enseigné beaucoup et qui m'ont inspiré par leurs travaux aussi. I became a student of Canadian history at an exciting time. History as a discipline was changing with the emergence of social history. Feminist critiques were reshaping the academy and scholarship, and it is the broad, ever-expanding, ever-critical area of feminist scholarship that I owe my greatest debts and to which I hope I've made my major contributions. My earliest research sought to gender the story of Canada's Industrial Revolution by showing that women's domestic labour, as well as the wage earning of husbands, sons and daughters, allowed both working class families and capitalism to survive during Montreal's Industrial Revolution. More recently, I have explored the multiple trajectories that women followed as they went from wives to widows in 19th century Montreal. I remain interested in marriage and the law. In writing Wife to Widow, I discovered a new and unexpected pleasure in piecing together biographies of individuals and families in much the same way as genealogists do, the very opposite of the quantitative analyses that had framed my earliest work. This has become a passion in my latest research project, which explores questions of colonialism, marriage, property, and inheritance in 19th century settler colonies of the British Empire. I've researched legislation, parliamentary debates, and reported legal cases regarding such issues in 4 colonies, the Cape, New Zealand, Victoria, Australia, and Quebec, and am still making sense of changing laws and legal issues in those jurisdictions. But in a way, I've been sideswiped, completely seduced by particular family conflicts over inheritance that spilt out of the courts and case books into the newspapers, legislative assemblies, or higher courts, sometimes shifting laws, sometimes shifting jurisprudence, and changing the history of that colony. But most of all, I'm interested in the individual lives. I've zeroed in on one family story in each colony that reveals important elements of the law, of lives lived, of that colony's history, and that speaks to the ways issues of marriage, property, and inheritance transcended particular colonies and nations and merit a transnational or empire-wide approach. So let me simply share the skeleton of the family history I'm currently writing up. Time limitations may well mean you have to draw your own conclusions about its significance. Caroline Baxter's husband's will, written in Victoria, Australia in 1865, highlights the extreme power that freedom of willing gave to husbands under the 19th century British common law. Edward Carney promised her an annuity of £100, no inconsiderable sum, but only if she and their children went to Ireland, the country of his birth. Should she remain in the colonies, all her interest in my will is to cease, he wrote. Here was one of the most draconian provisions I had ever read in a will. Caroline, was born and raised in England. She migrated to New South Wales and then Victoria in 1851 with her siblings and parents. They had remained connected within the colony. She had never been to Ireland. So, in trying to make sense of this will, I've explored their experience as colonisers, mined information in newspapers, archives in Australia, England, and Ireland, as well as on genealogical sites, and most recently made contacts with the descendants on both sides of the family. Perhaps, I initially thought, something in their experience farming in the outback had soured Edward's ambitions as a settler. Was it Caroline's encounter with dispossessed, starving Aboriginal men and women who the newspapers reported attacked their station seeking food while Edward was away? Or was it the trouble Edward had with scab-infested sheep, something a New Zealander would understand? Or the experience of 7 minutes of drilling wells inland with no steady water? These experiences were, I think, constitutive of their identities as colonisers, and ultimately it was digging wells that led to Edward's death. But such challenges offer only a partial explanation. He was an Irish Catholic, she was Anglican. This mattered little in the newly colonised areas of South Australia and Victoria where they settled, and 2 minutes left, and raised a girl and 6 boys. Protestant ministers were rare and Catholic priests even rarer. It was when Edward returned to Ireland in 1864 to visit his family that the seeds of this idea seem to have been planted. He returned to an island transformed since his 1842 departure by famine, emigration, and Catholic resurgence. His youngest brother Patrick had become a zealous priest, heavily involved in religious and land reform. They sent Edward back to Australia with another brother, William, and a Catholic governess. In the words of his eldest son, "Father returned home and brought a lot of minions of his own to eat up what was mine. Poor mother got awful persecution from them, and they made a wide breach between husband and wife and wanted to make all of us Catholics, but I never would be." Caroline did not initially contest the conditions of Edward's will. However, between his death in the early 1880s, she went to court at least 7 times, seeking to deal with the interventions of her brothers-in-law, to secure support for herself and the children, or the promised annuity, or to overturn or delay implementation of the will. 7 months after Edward's death, William's brother scooped her daughter from their station and placed her hundreds of miles away with Catholic nuns in Geelong, south of Melbourne. Caroline successfully claimed habeas corpus over her daughter. William opposed her. Newspapers reported that mother and daughter were happily reunited, yet the 12-year-old Mary Ellen died in the convent 2 months later. Nearly 2 years later, Caroline initiated a suit seeking to overturn Edward's wishes, claiming it would be dangerous for the children to travel as they were consumptive. Judge Molesworth's response was that it was his business to carry out men's wills and not consider what would be best for their families. So she tried again and again to go to court to delay, ends up moving back to Ireland, where she ends up in another legal case fighting against the brothers-in-law. Eventually, all the boys go back to Australia. She returned to England, died at the age of 51 of dropsy and cirrhosis. So what is up to you?
Questions, please. You need to use the microphone.
Yes. What happened?
What happened?
So that was the end of the actual story, is that they all returned to Ireland, that brother priest has the older boys put in a quite prestigious Catholic boys' college that's trying to train the Catholic tenantry of the upper orders to get into the civil service, a place that trained quite a few good revolutionaries in Ireland, but there was a complete prison to these 3 boys who had hunted and rode their horses in the outback of Australia. They bolt after 3 months. She ends up in court because the brothers say she has to make them Catholics. she actually wins because the first Catholic Lord Chancellor examines the boys and decides that they have quite a bit of Protestantism and Protestant knowledge in them, but no Catholic knowledge, and that it would be better for them to be raised Protestants than to be raised with no religion at all. I think she started drinking in Australia, and her drinking got worse and worse in Dublin, where she set up in quite a nice house. Gradually she starts selling off bits of the property, ends up in Camden Town in London as a boarder in a labourer's house, and then dies, presumably, at least in part from her drinking. And then all the sons end up in Australia, and they have relatives today who are very keen on their own family history and interested in learning more, despite the characters involved. There are other so whats, but...
Thank you very much, Bettina.